In the year 1860, an amateur archaeologist named David Wyrick discovered stone-encrypted artifacts in a pyramid-like mound 10 miles south of Newark, Ohio. The first artifact was in a small stone coffin, cemented together, and depicted a man thought to be an artistic depiction of Moses, holding two stones with ancient block Hebrew written all around the stone. The block Hebrew was interpreted to be the writing of the Ten Commandments. Within the same year, and in the same mound, an artifact called the Keystone was found with more block Hebrew. Of course, mainstream archaeologists and academia dismissed these findings as impossible and labeled them as hoaxes. Wyrick was accused of creating the artifacts in order to obtain notoriety. However, there is evidence to suggest this simply isn't the case. Jeffery created an excellent short documentary about the findings that I will show you here.
This is the Johnson Humrick House Museum, just east of Newark in Coshocton, Ohio. It is home to two of the most controversial artifacts ever discovered in American history, the Newark Holy Stones. More than 130 years after their discovery, these mysterious artifacts continue to puzzle scientists and historians. Newark, Ohio is home to some of the largest and most complex earthworks found anywhere in the world. Constructed from the earth, the mounds take on different shapes and sizes. But the identity of the mound builders, the purpose of the monuments they left behind, remains a mystery to this day. Much of the controversy surrounding the Newark Holy Stones revolves around their discoverer, David Wyrick. Wyrick was the local surveyor who had a passion for archaeology. Like many others of the era, he had a theory regarding the identity of the people who built these great monuments. A common opinion in Wyrick's time was that the mounds were constructed by the lost tribes of Israel or other Hebrew groups. The Indians who lived near or around the mound groups had no history regarding their purpose nor knowledge of the mound's use. Wyrick and the others had good reason to believe that the mounds had been constructed by Hebrews. The Quaker William Penn remarked that when he was among the Indians, he could easily imagine himself in the Jewish quarter of London. So great were the resemblances of features and gestures between the Indians and the Jews. Caleb Atwater, one of the early figures in American archaeology, cites the Bible, 2 Kings, that the Israelites built them in high places, mounds, in all of their cities. Atwater further states that the Israelites conducted great national affairs on these mounds. Here they crowned kings, concluded peace, and declared war. They assembled to worship and they buried their illustrious dead. But perhaps the most interesting observation that Atwater made was the following. He wrote, the Hebrews would gather at Gilgal. The name Gilgal signifies heap. Here was a pile of stones brought up from the river Jordan and piled up when they encamped for the first night on their journey to the Promised Land. Let the reader examine similar piles of stone on the waters of the Licking near Newark, Ohio.
Who were the mound builders? Everybody had an opinion. And David's opinion agreed with a lot of other people, although it was ridiculed, that is, that they were at least descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. Because after all, the Indians were savages and they could not have built geometric works such as these. So when David discovered stones with Hebrew on them, then the trouble began. To do a chronology on the events relative to the discovery of the Holy Stones of Newark, you need to start with the fact that David Wyrick was an amateur archaeologist. And he had apparently retired somewhere in 1858, 1859. And this puts us into June of 1860, when he and his son were digging in the McCrory's Woods, which is near the Octagon Mound in Newark, Ohio. It was there that they found, buried in a pit there, what has come to be called, because a newspaper reporter said it was that, a holy stone. It had characters on it. It was identified and looked at by a number of people in Newark, including the mayor of the town, who was really quite a scientist. Charles Whittlesey, the founder of the Western Reserve Historical Society and Ohio's foremost archaeologist at the time, and the local Episcopal clergyman who rather quickly translated it. It caused all kinds of excitement. In fact, the story is they formed a committee and everybody went out and started digging, hunting for some more of them, and probably destroyed more archaeological stuff as a result of finding this than anything else that went on.
And there was much excitement because there was much interest in determining the history of the people that built these mounds and earthworks. And so far as anyone knew prior to that, they had no history. Nothing was written down. There were no languages. This was an interesting find because it had a written language inscribed into it, and it was Hebrew. And many people at that time, including David Wyrick, were trying to prove that these mounds and earthworks had been built by the lost tribes of Israel or other Hebrew groups.
That got some attention, and David was invited to Cincinnati by the reporter. There, it was first denounced by a Hebrew scholar as being too modern Hebrew, denounced by a foremost sculptor, Jones, who sculpted the bust of Lincoln, who said, just adorn, anybody could make that. So David spent his only $19 on the trip and didn't get anything in recompense, came home, but he did strike up some friendships because he was encouraged, I think, by Dr. Unzicker to go down to near Jacksontown and look at the site that had once been the Great Stone Mound, where there were a number of mounds, one of which had been opened in 1850 by local farmers. When David got there, there was a wooden coffin. And I might put in here, I keep asking professional archaeologists to tell me where the American mound builders buried in coffins, and they never come up with one. But the coffin was still there, containing a skeleton with copper rings on it. It still was hair associated with the skull and cloth, which is rather interesting. David brought the coffin home, and it was lost to history. That was in early July. He went back again in November with another digging party, and they were digging, as David said in his letter, to see if it would hold water, the clay basin that was there. This was clay that was brought in. It was apparently clay brought in from the strip mine, what we call the strip mine area, the coal mine areas of Ohio. It was there that he uncovered the stone box that contained the Decalogue stone.
Today, Interstate 70 runs directly through the heart of what was once the largest man-made monument in the Ohio Valley, the Great Stone Mound. It stood approximately 55 feet high and had a base measurement of nearly 200 feet. From a distance, the mound resembled a pyramid. It was constructed of large boulders that were hauled away around 1850 to reinforce the dike of what is now Buckeye Lake. When the larger stones were removed, 15 small mounds surrounding a larger mound in the center were revealed. In 1860, Wyrick excavated the larger center mound. It was here that he discovered the coffin and body. Wyrick and his group started to dig in the clay beneath the coffin. 2 feet later, they discovered the stone box that contained the Decalogue stone.
They had a good argument as to whether this time they should open it or not, because everybody back there in Newark didn't believe them. So we'll take it back to them and show them. But apparently their curiosity got the best of them, and there was a hole in one end of this stone, this box apparently, and one of the men blew in the box, and it opened. The two halves separated, and that's when they uncovered the famous Decalogue stone, a black piece of slate. Actually, it's alabaster, but there's alabaster all over the world. Very soft black sandstone with a priestly figure and characters on every single surface.
A few of these letters look like standard Hebrew, but most of them don't. But working from the clue that a few of them look like standard Hebrew, John McCarty, again, that was Episcopalian minister in Newark, was able to decipher the rest of the letters and discover that the the text here is basically an abridged version of the Ten Commandments, or Decalogue, written in Hebrew language, but in this funny alphabet. And over the head of this robed and bearded figure is the name Moshe, or Moses in Hebrew. So presumably this is Moses giving the Ten Commandments. Well, the alphabet that's used on the Decalogue stone is actually one of its most interesting peculiarities. Well, this chart compares the standard Hebrew alphabet to the alphabet that appears on the Decalogue stone. This column here is basically standard Hebrew letters, and these are the Decalogue letters. About half the letters here are basically standard Hebrew. You can see the bet is basically the same, the dalet is basically the same, the hey is basically the same, and so forth. But perhaps half of the letters are very unusual, in fact, essentially unknown as Hebrew.
I mean, it was, I think, carefully crafted by a stonemason. I think whoever invented this alphabet was pretty sophisticated in their knowledge of Hebrew and gave sort of the table and the alphabet to a stonemason to carve.
So that whoever made this actually planned out exactly what he or she wanted to say in advance and carefully planned how it was going to be arranged on this stone and didn't just make cuts or additions at the last minute to make it all fit in.
One of the most incredible aspects of this is that when David Wyrick discovers the Keystone, and it's basically accepted, but it doesn't prove what he expected it to have proven, 4 months later, he finds the object, the Decalogue stone, which answers all of the criticisms leveled by the critics of the Keystone. It was found beneath a 40-foot tall stone mound. It's got a bizarre, archaic Hebrew alphabet on it, not like the modern Hebrew on the Keystone. How? I mean, it stretches the credibility to think that 4 months later, in the same year, somebody looking for could find just exactly what they wanted to find to answer all of the criticisms of their critics. I mean, that just doesn't happen in science. I mean, these people spend their lives working on problems like this. The answer doesn't just pop up 4 months later.
For some reason, someone has chosen to use this very unusual alphabet, which I haven't been able to find anywhere in any source for any of the standard sources of the history of the Hebrew alphabet. So perhaps if that can be discovered, it would be a big clue as to who these people were and why it was, how it happened to get in central Ohio.
Wyrick's discovery of the Keystone drew some attention, but the finding of the Decalogue stone drew national interest. The reaction to this latest discovery quickly drew the ire of people from the media and scientific community.
And he was, shortly thereafter, denounced in Harper's Weekly magazine by Francis Bacon as having created frauds. A very terrible writing, much as saying nothing good could come out of Ohio. You know, that's out in the middle of nowhere, let alone artifacts of any value. They must be frauds.
I don't think there's any real evidence now that says that he was the one that did it, but on the other hand, fraud and deception and things like this are not all that uncommon in science. There have been some wonderful studies of that lately, that people that could do something like this, they're not doing it in some cases to fool people. They're doing it because they know that it's the truth. They know that the lost tribes of Israel built these mounds. They're helping the truth along. And that's how some people would see their participation in this. I haven't been able to find the evidence, but I know it's there, and people are stubbornly refusing to believe me, so I've just got to help the truth along a little bit.
Is that the artwork on this woodcut here, which was made by David Wyrick in 1861, is very different than the artwork which appears on the Decalogue stone itself. So even on artistic grounds, it's clear that it was not David Wyrick who carved the Decalogue stone.
When I look at them, two things strike me. One, the stones differ in the type of writing. One's more stylized than the other. One is sort of almost longhand, and one is kind of printing, as for my interpretation. Secondly, they're done in different ways. One is scraped. One is pecked out. Quite different. But more importantly, when I look particularly at the box in which the Decalogue stone was found, which contains holes There's no apparent reason for them, as if you're going to stand something up in them. Slots as if the two lids were held together by something, and so on. Who, if he's going to fake something, would go to all of this trouble?
Is it possible that ancient Hebrews made it to the New World and colonized America before Columbus and others?
Is it possible? Sure, it's possible. Is there any evidence that this happened? No. No evidence whatsoever to this date that stands up to the standards of science. The die-offs that occurred after 1492 couldn't have happened because the people would have been exposed to the old world diseases, and it's a historical event that can only happen once. It can't happen again, and the massive graves and the massive deaths that occurred after 1492 tell us that that's when the first sustained and substantial contact with the old world occurred. And it's a biological fact that little carved stone objects can't refute.
Personally, I wouldn't be interested in these things if I didn't think they had a very good chance of being authentic. I'm not a Hebrew scholar myself, but these things have gotten me interested enough that I've learned a little bit about the Hebrew alphabet and something about the history of the Hebrew alphabet.
Frankly, I think that Newark, Ohio, at one time, was sort of a Mecca or Jerusalem kind of place, a place to which one would come for great religious events, a place to which one would bring the remains of the famous people, just as we will take people to Rome to bury them in St. Peter's Basilica. I think people were brought here, and that these are perhaps mementos or talismans or something associated with famous people. And this is particularly, in my mind, particularly true of the site where the Decalogue stone was found, for several reasons. One is, it had been buried in a mountain of carried-in stones. The canal builders hauled away between 10 and 15,000 wagon loads of stone.
The story of the Holy Stones continues to baffle individuals to this day. We may never know whether or not these artifacts are genuine, but we do know what became of Wyrick and his efforts to prove his theory.
David Wyrick comes through as a very sad character. He apparently had very little victories in his life. He came to Newark after having failed the newspaper business in the Hocking Valley. He was the county surveyor, and along with that, he continued his hobby in archaeology and digging, as did everybody else at that period of time. But he was forthright. He corresponded with the Smithsonian, and when he discovered these stones, obviously he got national attention, at least as far as New York City, but was denounced. And by that time, his rheumatoid arthritis had become so bad he could not work anymore, so by 1858, 1859, somewhere along in there, he had to quit. He tried to sell the stones, corresponding with the authorities in New York. It was very unsuccessful. And we find in a Newark Advocate, dated April 15th, 1864, the notice of the sheriff's sale of his properties, which meant everything he owned was put on the auction block. And that included, apparently, my guess, the Holy Stones. And his heart was in these stones. He tried to sell them in New York and was unsuccessful. And when in 1864, the sheriff's sale notice was given to him, he apparently took more laudanum than he could handle. As at least the newspaper says, he apparently died from an overdose of laudanum. We did find his burying spot in Cedar Hill Cemetery, and there is a much eroded stone there. And maybe someday I'll take up a collection and we'll replace it.
As said by one of the professionals in the documentary, this archaic block Hebrew is not yet recorded anywhere else in the world, so rightfully so, there was much skepticism around the findings. That is until many years later, around 1900, Block Hebrew, now called Paleo-Hebrew, is now understood to be an older developmental stage of language that comes from the Phoenician language, which is dated to have emerged around the 10th century BC. The oldest form of this writing comes from the Zayat stone, found in 2005 in Israel. In 1889, another archaeologist by the name of John Emmert found a mound in Loudoun County, Tennessee. In the mound, he discovered 7 skeletons lined up next to each other, facing north, and 2 others separate from the 7, with one facing north and the other facing south. Under one of the 2 separate skeletons' skulls were several artifacts. The artifacts consisted of 2 brass bracelets, a drilled fossil, 1 bead, a bone thought to be a wind flute, polished wood pieces, and an engraved stone. The engraved stone, now known to be called the Bat Creek Stone, was found to be encrypted with Paleo-Hebrew writing. At the time, Emmert theorized the engravings to be Cherokee, and many dismissed these findings as fraudulent. The artifacts were stored away in the Smithsonian archives until one day in 1964, a scholar looking for evidence of pre-Columbian contact unearthed the pieces once again.
In 1964, Henrietta Mertz, a U.S. patent attorney, rediscovered the stone while researching possible pre-Columbian contact with travelers from Europe or even Africa. She looked at the stone, read what notes there were, and realized that if the stone was rotated 180 degrees, the characters once thought to be Cherokee were very similar to early Phoenician. She took the stone to Cyrus Gordon, one of the top scholars of such things, who determined by 1970 that the inscription was early Hebrew, dated around the 1st century A.D. The Smithsonian immediately declared the stone to be a fake. So the work of the Bristol native, John Emmert, was called into question. Did he create and plant this artifact to try to impress his bosses at the Smithsonian, or even to advance his theory that the mound builders were actually Cherokee? And if he did, why would he have carved very early Hebrew on the stone? By the 1980s, carbon-14 dating had become accurate, but a stone couldn't be dated. It had to be an artifact that had once been a living thing in order for the process to work. The stone couldn't be dated, but the small pieces of wood could be dated. The results came back and were determined that the wood had been a living tree sometime between 100 AD and 700 AD, long before the Cherokee lived here and certainly long before John Emmert was digging in the mounds along Back Creek. Of course, the stone could have been planted by Emmert. It wasn't dated, so there's no real way of determining when the stone was carved. Or is there? This is Scott Walter. He is a forensic geologist. He's an expert of determining the weathering and thus the age of carvings in stone.
And the bottom line is that the weathering of the inscription is very old. And the only way that that could happen is because it's documented that it was found in 1889. The only thing that has changed on that stone since it was discovered is that sometime between the picture that was taken in 1891, there's 2 scratches on the stone, they're not there. But in 1970, the stone is published in Argosy magazine. They did an article about Cyrus Gordon's work, and those scratches are there. And it turns out during my examination, those scratches were freshly made. They created a geologic profile that was totally inconsistent with the original inscription. And in fact, it was the key piece of evidence that gave me the confidence to say, there's no reason to question the veracity of this discovery. John Emmert did not do anything that he has been accused of doing, and this is a genuine, legitimate artifact that has been in that mound is at least as old as when those people were placed in the mound, because it was under the skull of that deceased person.
And there were those 2 brass bracelets.
The bracelets that were found with the artifact were also tested for metal content. And interestingly enough, they contained copper, zinc, tin, and lead. Rarely do you see lead, but the lead was put in there to give the metal more malleability. But the ratio of the 2 bracelets together with samples that were tested of 1st and 2nd century Jewish bronze work in the Mediterranean, were so statistically close, it's unbelievable.
The Back Creek Stone, as it's now called, is not the only artifact that's been found to contain Semitic inscriptions.
I've looked at many things across this country. There is a myriad of artifacts and sites, pre-Columbian artifacts and sites that date back thousands of years from people that were here from other continents, mostly from across the Atlantic, but people came across the Pacific as well.
But how on earth could people from the Middle East have made the trip to East Tennessee around the time of Christ? About the same time that Cyrus Gordon was publishing his findings that the writings were early Hebrew, a Norwegian explorer named Thor Heyerdahl was launching his second expedition to prove that man could sail a boat made from only materials found in the Middle East in ancient times using the Canary Current to travel from North Africa to the New World. Heyerdahl succeeded, and the papyrus boat which he sailed now sits on display at the Kon-Tiki Museum in Oslo, Norway. But just because it could be done doesn't mean that it was done. And even after the Atlantic crossing, it's still an incredibly long voyage to end up on the banks of the Little Tennessee. I'm not an archaeologist, so I'm not qualified to make conclusions, but in researching this story, one thing kept bugging me. Most sources say that Native Americans crossed over from Asia on a land bridge that connected what is now Alaska to Siberia. But the race of people that are now called the mound builders seem to have originated from the deep south along the banks of the Mississippi River. Mounds in Louisiana have been dated to be the oldest, and the mounds further from the Mississippi Delta are known to be the latest. So where did these people come from if they migrated not from Siberia but from the Gulf of Mexico? The location of the Back Creek Mounds is now under several feet of water under Tellico Lake. And of course John Emmert has been dead for over 100 years, so we may never know the truth about the Back Creek Stone. So was this small stone that was discovered by this Bristol native a fake or one of the greatest discoveries ever made on this continent? You decide.
There is much mystery around the ancient history of America and humanity in general that seems to have been kept out of the public eye for unknown reasons, but nonetheless intently. Now that the power of the internet is practically available to most people, it is our duty to uncover our true origins and discover who we really are. If you enjoy my work, please consider subscribing, liking the video, or making a donation. Thank you for taking the time to listen.